Plain Talk. I'm your host, Rob Port. Happy to be with you. Joining me later in the program is Senator Kevin Cramer, who is on for his very first appearance on the podcast. Now, the reason why Cramer is kind of important to this show, back when I was doing terrestrial radio on WDAY, then Congressman Cramer was on the show every week, and he took phone calls. And I wanted to replicate that on the podcast. Now, obviously, we can't do live phone calls because we pre-record the podcast and then distribute it, and that's part of the convenience for you, the listeners, is you get to listen to this show whenever the heck you want. But that also means it's hard to do live call-in. So what we've been doing is, if you follow me on Facebook, if you follow me on Twitter, and you can find me there, just search for Rob Port, you'll find me. Become my friend. You'll see I'll start putting up posts and I'll solicit questions from you. So if there's something that you want to run by Senator Cramer, you can do so. You can post it on one of those threads. I'll monitor them and I'll ask the questions. You can also email them to me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. And the great thing about having Cramer on the podcast is when I'm asking him the questions, we don't have a commercial break bearing down on us that we have to get to. We could give him time to fully answer your questions. So to me, it's a service really to you, the listeners. He's your senator. He's my senator too. And this is a way for you to get access to him and ask questions and have him answer them candidly for you. And I honestly, frankly, I think it's a lot of fun. And as a bonus, Congressman Armstrong, who replaced Senator Cramer in the United States House of Representatives, is going to be doing the same thing. He'll be on later this week as well. And we're going to make this a weekly thing. We're going to do it as often as we can and just give you guys access to these fellas and let them answer your questions. So that's coming up later in the program. But before we get to that, I got a little bit of a rant on a debate going on in Bismarck. There's a John Hageman article that was out earlier this week. Headline was, "Despite pleas for road funding, North Dakota Senate rejects gas tax increase." The legislation was Senate Bill 2288. It failed on a 26-18 vote. It was pushed by Republican Senator Larry Lueck. He's from Fairmount, North Dakota. It would have increased North Dakota's taxes on motor vehicle and special fuels to 27 cents per gallon. Now, what's interesting is this hasn't been changed since 2005. So we're going on like 14 years of the same tax that we've had the entire time. By the way, the federal tax of 18.4 cents per gallon hasn't been increased since 1993. Now, as introduced, the bill would have increased fuel taxes to 30 cents per gallon, but it was amended down. It would have, the amended version, which ultimately failed, but it would have generated $59.2 million in revenue during the 2-year budget cycle. So it's about a $60 million tax hike. Now, it was voted down. I will tell you that I am, and by the way, there's other bills like this before the legislature. There was and by the way, there's another bill to raise the gas tax to 30 cents per gallon. It was introduced by a Democratic lawmaker. That's still alive in the House. There's also a bill that the Senate's going to be considering to consider raising driver's license fees. And there is, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm a conservative person. You're not very often going to hear me advocating for the government taking more of our money. That being said, I think we do reach a point in some of these debates where if we're not willing to raise any of these fees, this is what puts upward pressure on taxes like the income tax, taxes like the sales tax. Now, I will tell you, I don't necessarily mind the gas tax. I understand why the politics around it are so hard. A lot of people don't like it because fuel prices are one of the most visible economic prices in our economy. They're literally posted alongside the road. You drive up and down the roads, you see gas stations advertising their fuel prices. So when they go up, they go down, it's very, very visible. Now, and by the way, we all have to use fuel. I mean, it's like the cost of food too. It's like the cost of bread. It's one of those things. It's not really a fungible commodity. We all have to have fuel. Some amount. We got to get to work. Those prices are built in. They affect the economy. So when fuel prices go up, it's more expensive for all of us. I get that. I understand it. But I like the fuel tax in that it is essentially a user tax, right? Now, we're running into some problems, and as a matter of fact, that's another bill before the legislature. I believe it passed in the House, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, or maybe it was the Senate. Anyway, it was basically a bill which would have imposed a fee on electric vehicles. And the fee is essentially in lieu of the fact that these electric vehicles are not paying the fuel tax. Because what the fuel tax goes towards is maintaining our roads. Which is why I like the fuel tax, because despite the difficulties with some emerging manners of propelling our motor vehicles that are on the roads, it amounts to a user fee, right? So if you drive a lot on the roads, you buy more fuel, you pay more tax. Generally, I like that. I like user fees. I like when we can take an expense of government and tie it as closely as possible to the people using that government service. So in the instance of the roads, the people who use the roads the most are paying the most tax. That's great. That's how it should be. But because the politics around this, and it's almost, I guess what I could compare it to is sort of a NIMBY attitude, right? You know that acronym, NIMBY, not in my backyard. Mostly you see it crop up in people not wanting, somebody who, they don't want some development in their area, right? They don't want a new apartment building in their area. They don't want a new, landfill near their property or whatever. So it's the not in my backyard attitude. And I think it's almost comparable to that, this attitude about taxes, right? Where people don't want to pay a higher fuel tax, so we never raise the fuel tax. Again, in North Dakota, the fuel tax hasn't been raised since 2005. At the federal level, it hasn't been raised since 1993. That's more than 2 decades. That's a little scary. Why aren't we raising these taxes? And it's because of politics. Which leads me back to another theme that I return to often in my podcasts and in my writing, which is that I think democracy and free markets are very, very good at delivering the American public what they want, even if it's something that they don't admit that they actually want. So, for instance, what happens is because there's so much political resistance to raising, say, the fuel tax or raising, other sorts of taxes or whatever, there's so much resistance to it, but yet simultaneously, we all want lots of government programs. We all want, really nice roads and rest areas and no potholes and well-maintained, and we want them plowed and all that good stuff. These two things are contradictory, right? You can't have well-maintained roads and then really low taxes, right? You can't have two of these things. If you want well-maintained roads, you're going to have to pay for them. And that goes across government. If you want lots of government services, you're going to have to pay for them. And what happens is through politics and through this sort of, because we don't really have a lot of very principled voters in this country, what we'll see is people voting for expansive programs. They want luxurious roads. They want expansive government programs. They want lots of government services, and they want low taxes. Now, they don't necessarily mind if somebody else's taxes gets hiked, which is why it's so popular. You'll hear politicians talking all the time about taxing the rich or taxing the corporations or, doing this, that, or the other thing, cutting foreign aid. None of these are really workable solutions to our budget and our national debt and deficit problems, but they sound good. They're good politics, right? In reality, what should be happening is we all should have some skin in the game when it comes to paying for our government. I firmly believe that. I think everybody should pay taxes. I don't necessarily like progressive tax codes. I like tax codes that keeps everybody some skin in the game when it comes to paying for the government. Now, I don't necessarily mind that people who make less pay less and people who make more pay more. I think that's probably okay. But generally, everybody should pay something. And when government gets bigger, everybody should pay a little bit more because we should understand that the government belongs to all of us, right? What is that famous quote for President Obama? Government is a name for the things that we do together. I'm not sure I believe in that statement in the way that he meant to believe in it, but in terms of the fact that the government, we're all responsible for paying for it, I believe in it that way. And I believe that if we're going to vote to make the government bigger, or if we're going to vote for the government to do more things, then it should cost us more, and it should cost everybody more. And we should all agree, okay, well, that's what we're going to pay in exchange for getting more from the government. But then getting back to the fuel taxes, that's why I simultaneously support the idea of user fees. So tie the cost of the government program, in this instance roads, as closely as possible to the people getting the most benefit from it. That way, if we need to spend more on roads to maintain them, we need to build more roads, we need to build wider roads, we need to spend more on maintaining them or whatever it is, the people who are going to pay the most are the people who use it the most. That's fair. That's fairness. And so it doesn't necessarily always have to be, well, we got to spend more on roads, so we're going to raise taxes on everybody. It's, no, we're going to spend more on roads, and we're going to raise the tax that the people who use the roads the most pay. This makes sense to me. This is logical to me. This seems like a very sound way to govern, and yet we don't like this because of populism, because of populist politics, because of the fact that what Americans really want, even though we say we don't like deficits and debt, what we really like is low taxes or somebody else paying the taxes while we get expansive government and lots of government services. And the thing is that generally the government delivers it, not so much here at the state level, although resistance to raising North Dakota's fuel taxes, despite there being a pressing need for more spending on our roads, is an example of that. But at the federal level, we have the perfect example, because what do we get year after year after year? We get the government delivering exactly what the American taxpayer wants: expansive government, low taxes. And then what happens? We run a budget deficit in the hundreds of billions of dollars every year, sometimes even in the trillions of dollars. That's democracy, giving us exactly what we want. That's populism, giving us exactly what we want, because we spend so much time talking about the wisdom of the masses. We spend so much time talking about the will of the people. Well, what if the will of the people is irresponsible? What if the will of the people is, the equivalent to you financing your household budget on credit cards? I mean, what if that's the will of the people? Sometimes the will of the people is not a good idea. I understand the counter-argument to that. What, should we just turn everything over to benevolent dictators? Should we turn everything over to some technocratic elite to run things for us? Well, no, I don't necessarily agree with that either. But at some point, I guess what I'm saying is we, the public, have to be willing to say, you know what, if we want better roads, we'd better pay for them. If we want better schools, we better be willing to pay for them. And to the extent that we want to manage what, sort of financial impacts are on us so that we don't, spend our ways into ourselves into poverty or spend ourselves into economic stagnation because it's so expensive to start a business, it's so expensive to live a life, well then, we do things like user fees, or we do things like, making sure that the government is narrowly focused on the things that we really want them to do and not off doing all these other extracurricular things that really the government has no business doing in the first place. But we've got to get this NIMBY attitude out of politics. And I don't know that NIMBY is the right word for it, but we've got to get this attitude out of politics where it's, I don't want to raise any taxes, but simultaneously, I want the government to do lots and lots of things. If you want the government to do lots and lots of things, then you got to be willing to pay for it. And you know what? You should be willing to pay for it yourself. Not I want the government to give me lots of things and then tax those people over there for it. No, that doesn't work. That's part of the responsibility of being a citizen, I think, is being willing to pay for the government. Now, personally, because I'm a conservative, I like the government to do very little and to tax me very little. And I'm willing to accept that the government is going to provide me with fewer services. And in turn, I will be willing to deal with that and enjoy my lower tax burdens. Now, I know not everybody's going to agree with me, but that should be the standpoint. I'm willing to accept that trade-off, the government doing less in exchange for me getting taxed less. Simultaneously, if you want the government to do more, you should be willing to allow the government to tax you more. And if we all were principled in that way, I feel like our country would work a lot better. But instead, we all pretend like we are principled in that way when we're not really, and we could tell we're not really because the politicians reacting to what it is we really want deliver us hypocrisy. I firmly believe that we get exactly the government that we vote for. We say we don't. We say we don't want budget deficits. We say we don't want, these politicians. But the politicians are reacting to us, and they're giving us what we want. That's it for today's rant. Senator Kevin Cramer up next. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me now. Kevin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, Rob. Thank you. How are you doing? It's much warmer in Washington than it is in North Dakota, I can tell you that.
I tell you, it's one of the few times I wish I was in Washington and not North Dakota. Every time I turn around, there's another 3 inches of snow on my driveway. And It's my least favorite time of year. I don't mind the cold so much. I don't like the constant little bit of snowing, right, that never ends, and you got to go out and push snow off the driveway every 2 hours. I don't like that so much.
I don't either. I like one big snowfall. I get to get my snowblower out, get everything just perfect the way I like it, and then enjoy that for a couple weeks.
Pick a lane, right? Let's either get a foot of snow or nothing, right? One or the other.
That's right.
All right. Well,
anyway,
this is your first time on the podcast. We were doing weekly radio segments, and then my radio show went away because we're switching over to a digital mode. This is your first time on the podcast.
And I love it. I think this is a great format, particularly for this kind of a discussion. It's a nice, still very interactive, but also very available and accessible to people. So no, I'm grateful for the opportunity, Rob. I think congratulations on it. I think it's great.
It's been a lot of fun, and I think the only thing I miss are the phone calls. I do like taking because when you brought somebody on, you didn't know what you're going to get. I loved it.
That's right.
But maybe there's a way to integrate that at some point. Well, I got some questions for you, but before we get to those, I wanted to ask a State of the Union address last night. And by the way, the My Pillow guy, how did that happen? How did you end up being your guest?
So it's very funny because he really wasn't my main guest. Every member gets one guest, and mine was Jody D. Weeaway, who's an NDSU engineering recent graduate, still works in Fargo and in Minneapolis, back and forth, an Indian immigrant that's involved in some stuff I've been working on immigration reform. But, Mike Lindell, who's a good friend, had called me, and of course he's a friend of the president's as well. The president has used him as an example a couple of times in terms of successful entrepreneurs, and of course he's he's mastered the art of television. And he and I were talking. He's coming out here for the prayer breakfast, which is tomorrow. Now, remember, originally the State of the Union was a couple of weeks ago, supposedly. Well, it ends up being the same week as the prayer breakfast. So Mike was coming out, and he said, "Boy, it'd be fun to go to the State of the Union or something." Anyway, I said, "Well, let me see what I can do." And so, literally, while he was on board the airplane yesterday in Minneapolis, I was able to score one more ticket for the State of the Union. They didn't have a great seat, but you're in the room, and I did it through my friend Kevin McCarthy, of course, the minority leader in the House side. And so literally before he had, or after he'd gotten on the airplane, I was able to get him a ticket, and so he came as sort of a second guest, and it's always fun to see Mike and be around him, and he draws a lot of attention wherever he goes.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think some of your fellow members of Congress, do they practice making facial expressions before the state? Like they know the cameras are going to be on them. Do you think they get and stand in front of a mirror and this is the face I'm going to make when he makes this, and this is the hand gesture I'm going to make? Do they practice this? Are there coaches going around through the halls of Congress so that they can emote effectively for the cameras?
Okay, so I don't think there are any coaches walking around Congress, but maybe there are, but I've never been approached by one. But I can tell you that there's a lot of conscious planning that goes on for a lot of them, for everything from what tie to wear, what dress to wear, and they talk about it rather openly. And I think, geez, I probably should have thought about that this morning before I got dressed. I just don't. It's just not one of those things for me. And there are the certain people, and you'll notice them if you watch multiple States of the Union over the years, that get to the chamber very early and grab one of the seats by the center aisle so they can be seen and shake the president's hand and all of that. So yeah, there's no question that there are some people that put on a little more performance than others for the cameras. The thing about it is interesting. It is like a giant TV studio because you've got all these extra cameras. Now we're used to C-SPAN cameras, but when you give a speech on the floor, you know exactly what camera is probably on you most of the time. But when there are all these extra cameras and you're not the focal point, but you may want to be the focal point, which has never been my goal as a State of the Union address. The cameras do have the red lights that we've come accustomed to in a studio setting, whether you've been on a news show or whatever the case might be. So at least which cameras are live at the moment. No, they're all recording. But so yeah, I don't think there's any question. There are people who perform a little bit.
I wanted to. What do you think of the president's speech overall? I thought it was very good. And by the way, I thought the president's previous State of the Union, I think he does very well. And I think, I've not always been the biggest fan of the president or his style, But I think his State of the Union address has been great. I thought last night was absolutely great.
I agree, Rob. I thought it was the best of the three that he's delivered, or the 2.5, I guess. The first one's not technically a State of the Union address, but I thought it was very good. And I thought stylistically, in fact, it was, in some respects, it was more Trump than previous ones. In other respects, it was really more presidential than other ones. And that's not to say the two don't go together. But I thought his timing was better than usual. Let's face it, he's gotten more used to using the teleprompter. Previous to, about halfway through his presidential campaign, he probably never used one, and now he uses one for these big speeches, and he has clearly become more comfortable with it. So his timing and delivery was better. I thought it was a very well-written speech, by the way. But what I really liked about it was that he did have some fun. He wasn't offensive, or it didn't sort of, I don't know, react natively to the sort of the white, the white dress, white pantsuit sort of section that was clearly, making their own statements, and that's fine. It's their stage too. But instead of fighting against it, he had fun with it, and they went along with him. And in some ways, he kind of sucked them in. And I just thought it was a really rich moment when he was touting all the good, job statistics and economic statistics for women, and then puts the exclamation point on it by congratulating the largest, group of women to ever serve in the United States Congress. And suddenly they were all cheering together. And I just thought that was the showman part of him, Rob. But I also think he handled the individual stories, whether it was the Holocaust survivor,
those were great.
The World War II folks, they were just great. And he did it he's always been good at it, but I thought he was particularly dignified last night in the way he did it. And boy, he had a lot of them, and every one of them was a great story and touching.
I wanted to read you this. Jim Garrity, writing at National Review, he wrote this about the State of the Union. He said, when Trump sticks to the teleprompter, lays out his agenda, stops talking about himself, and starts talking about what his policies would do for the American people, you get a glimpse of the president he could be, with a little more discipline and focus, and a little less self-absorption and sensitivity to criticism. Do you agree with that?
Well, every time I agree with that principle and that, and that statement's pretty well put. I'm reminded that he's Donald Trump because he doesn't do those things. That there is that other part of him that is attractive to people who are tired of polished politicians, and that there's actually a trust in his authenticity when he says what other people wish they could say. But with regard to the focus on himself, that part has always been a little bit bothersome to me, because just take as an example. If I might just sort of dissect it a little bit, knowing how dangerous this is. His references to his handling of North Korea. I don't think anybody can deny that Donald Trump has brought Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table. He has overseen 15 months of relative peace with North Korea. That's been uncommon. He's got them coming back for, they're doing another summit. All of that's good news. The lack of testing of missiles, the return of hostages and remains. All of that's good news that stands on its own. But then when he says, if I hadn't been elected president, we'd be at war with North Korea. I don't know how you'd know that for sure. And it's not like we were on the brink of war with North Korea before he became president. It's just that we were sliding into a very bad place in a very unsafe peninsula. And I think his accomplishments are so good that sort of taking a victory lap like that's just unnecessary, and many times diminishes the actual accomplishment itself.
I want to switch gears here. You sent out a press release. You met with Attorney General nominee William Barr. What'd you think?
Well, I was very impressed, and I wasn't surprised that I would be impressed. But when you're talking to a guy who had been Attorney General several presidents ago, really now, and you think, well, why is he even doing this? I mean, clearly he must have a servant's heart and all that, and all the things I've ever heard about him were true. But I also really did want to prod him on this issue of cooperative federalism and the consolidated litigation authority of the Department of Justice. Two things that have frustrated me, two things that sort of go hand in hand. And I cited very specific cases, and so that people know, I sent him the questions prior to him coming in so that he could be prepared for that. Not that I need them to know every detail of the North Dakota cases, but more importantly, I wanted to know his philosophy, not just on governing, but on management of the Department of Justice, because I think it's been pretty clear that the Department of Justice, in many respects, has become a bit of its own client, and has forgotten that its responsibility is to the people that they work for and represent. And so the cases I cited, the one, of course, being the Environmental Integrity Project versus EPA case that was filed in California, but it was challenging North Dakota's enforcement of what's called RCRA laws. It's a solid waste. It's a solid waste case. And of course, when you file something like that in the Ninth Circuit with a liberal judge and you're a liberal organization, you're going to get a pretty good ruling. And in their case, it was actually a sue and settle ruling, which are always the worst, because North Dakota then filed to intervene in the case and was denied by the judge in California. Well, that was all under the Obama administration. Fast forward, the North Dakota appeals the case to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, or it gets appealed to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. So North Dakota goes to the D.C. Circuit to try and get the right to intervene. And now it's the Trump administration. And in the meantime, Scott Pruitt, who's the EPA administrator, bans all sue and settle cases. In other words, we're not going to go to friendly courts and settle apart from the people that are affected by the settlement. And so the Department of Justice, in my view, should have been advocating that position. Instead, they advocated for the Obama position. And the reason that bothers me is because obviously it completely ignores North Dakota's right to intervene in a case that directly affects their authority with its primacy to enforce these laws. That's number one. But the number two case is a case dealing with Billings County, federal lands out in Billings County, and Billings County's right to easements for roads and whatnot, which is, in my view, pretty clear law and tradition. And a lawsuit there that back in 2000 that was actually, the clock ran out on for North Dakota while the USDA attorneys delayed and delayed and delayed. Well, we continue to try and fix that problem. But every time you go to the USDA, they say, well, it's DOJ attorneys that won't let us do it. You go to DOJ and they say, well, they could do it, but it's up to the USDA attorneys. And all of this because of a law back in the 60s that consolidated, for reasonable reasons, consolidated DOJ or consolidated federal government litigation under the Department of Justice. But unlike North Dakota, which I think has a good model, where in North Dakota, every agency has an attorney who's an assistant attorney general, but they work for the agency. So when I was on the Public Service Commission, we had a couple of attorneys. We would hire these attorneys. They would advocate for our position on things, but they still were officially a deputy or assistant attorneys general. In this case, the Department of Justice litigators they basically defend their traditional position, which is generally a very liberal position, and to heck with the states and to heck with the new administration and their new policies. Now, some of that was Jeff Sessions' fault because he basically abdicated his responsibility as Attorney General, and he, as we all know, he famously recused himself from the Russia investigation, and in the process recused himself from the job, in my view. So I wanted to get good, solid commitments from him that he first of all would do everything as a matter of principle and priority to uphold and restore a culture of federalism at the DOJ, and that he would work to make sure that wasn't just the rule of the law, but actually the culture and the new tradition of cooperative federalism. So I was very pleased. His knowledge, but also just how personable he was, and his conviction seemed very genuine.
I want to get to some questions we have from listeners on Facebook. And for those of you listening to this, Kevin's going to be on the podcast every week. Every week on my Facebook, I am going to put up an open post where you can submit questions. You can also email them to me, rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can tweet them at me. There's a lot of different ways to get in touch with me. Send me your questions. I'll compile them, and I'll ask Kevin every week. Kevin, first question, and it's not really a question. It's linking to a satirical article which is making fun of you for the shutdown salary, suggesting that you donated your shutdown salary to your wife. Now, obviously, that's kind of critical, but explain the shutdown. I know you talked about this a lot. Senator Hoeven, Congressman Armstrong, the other two members of North Dakota's delegation, they donated their salaries to charity. You took yours. Explain that.
Well, first of all, when you take your salary and give it to charity and then make an announcement about the charity you gave it to, or you announced it, I'm so noble that this month I'm giving my salary to charity. I don't find that, and I don't mean to be critical of my friends who do it, but I don't find it very noble, frankly. In fact, I'm surprised that people think it is noble. What do they do with their salary the other 11 months? How much of that do they contribute? Do they tithe 10% to their church before paying taxes? And all of those things. I just don't want to get into that rut. I take a biblical view, frankly, of charity. And, I'm not even real big on, naming buildings after people or soliciting money for people to have their name on the building, even though I've done plenty of it as a fundraiser for the University of Mary and other charities that I've worked for. I understand that there's an appeal of that to some people, and that actually becomes a tool. It's never been mine on a personal level. So that's part of my problem with it. It just makes it easy. Money's fungible. So I could easily say that I gave my salary last month to charity and no one would know the difference. I give plenty of money over the course of a year that more than cover that amount of money, but that's not the point. The other thing about it is that really concerns me about this whole notion. First of all, the Congress did work. We worked. I mean, I went to many hearings and briefings, and we were at work. Every federal employee, whether they did or didn't work, got paid, and they should get paid on time, and that should be our commitment. That's why I'm a co-sponsor of a bill that would prevent government shutdowns in the future. But that said, they all got paid, and none of them were required to give their money to charity, and nor were they asked to, nor did anybody have to tell you who they gave their money to. So to me, it's a dangerous path to go down, and it smacks of just sort of grandstanding further at the expense of the downside of the shutdowns. But the other thing I would say is, and I don't mind saying this, and by the way, I never donate my salary to my wife, and I'm sort of a ridiculous notion, but my wife earns her salary. But that said, there are plenty of wealthy people in Congress. In fact, the disproportionate number of members of Congress are wealthy, but there are a lot of people in Congress who aren't wealthy. And, just as sure as it's important to have farmers that are on the ag committee, and, business people on the small business committee, and veterans on the armed services committee and things like that, I think it's equally important to have, people who grew up with fewer means and are used to a blue collar lifestyle, and remember their parents getting calls from the bill collectors when it was late in the month. And I think it's important to have regular people like that as well serving in Congress. And if we're just going to ask them to take an oath of poverty, and then I don't really see, I don't see much noble about that at all.
Another question from Facebook. Sarah asks, she says, please get my healthcare options back to the way they were. I haven't been to the doctor in 3 years. I won't be going as we don't have the coverage we used to have. My son has a congenital heart defect, so we keep our pockets ready for his needs. Is the Affordable Act helping those who didn't have insurance at the cost of my family? We have had insurance coverage our entire working lives. Now it's basically as if we have no coverage with the high deductible. I took on an additional part-time job to cover the expense of the chiropractor. I used to think at my age I would be preparing for retirement. However, we are unable to gear up for that because of our health care.
Yeah. So thanks for the question, Sarah. And by the way, thanks for the illustration, because it's like many of them that I've heard about. It's like many of what I consider the forgotten people in the whole Obamacare, enthusiasm. Because if you would, through your work, had been getting health care, which, by the way, well over half of the people in North Dakota, that's how they get their health care. And for those who are tempted to tempted by the lure of Medicare for all or the Kamala Harris health care plans, they would eliminate all of that. All of that would go away. Not only would it cost you more, you wouldn't even be able to get it. Your employer wouldn't be able to give it to you. I mean, some of them don't want any private insurance, in which case you'd have no marketplace, you'd have no competition, you'd have no natural market incentives. What you'd have is inferior health care, free to except to all the taxpayers. So what's coming next? Well, we've done a few things. One, we, of course, through the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, eliminated the individual mandate. In the most recent lawsuit, as a result of that, the lawsuit on the constitutionality of Obamacare, the whole thing, it has been ruled by a judge in Texas to be unconstitutional, although he did not stay it. So no doubt it'll be appealed. This moment opens the window that's last for probably at least 2 years, maybe more, depending on how quickly it would get to the Supreme Court. But it presents an incentive for people on all sides to come up with a solution that replaces some of those incentives that Sarah's probably referring to that provided all kinds of different options for people. That's, at the end of the day, that's the bottom line. For me personally, what I want to see us get back to is back to something more like that gives more of that authority to states and provides the tools either through the tax code or subsidies or whatever the case might be through the existing mechanisms to incent states to innovate. We have these state innovation grants, something that our governor was looking forward to. And the reason that's important is because then we can get to the drivers of the cost of healthcare. And innovation is certainly one of the ways to do that. And like I said, our state and our governor has some really good ideas that would actually do that, bring down the cost. But eliminating all private insurance and eliminating coverage by your employer would be an awful idea. I will tell you this, Sarah. Last week I had breakfast with Alex Acosta. Alex is of course, the Secretary of Labor, and it's the Secretary of Labor that's overseeing this implementation of the President's executive order on creating association health plans. So if you have an association of farmers, whether it's Farmers Union or Farm Bureau, I pick those two groups because they're already in the insurance business, they can provide through their association the type of options and the type of plans that large employers can now offer and do offer, which is oftentimes very good insurance. That could be true of any association that you're a part of or you'd want to create or join. And so he's going to be coming out with the rules for the association plans here before very long. And he's also accepted my invitation to come to North Dakota and talk about it. So to me, that's a real grand opportunity, particularly for those entrepreneurs, small business, self-employed people for whom insurance options went down and price went through the roof, particularly out-of-pocket costs beyond just the premium. The premiums went through the roof like Sarah's, but so does copay and high deductibles and things like that. So there's a lot in the works, and we've got a lot of work to get it done.
Daniel asks, he goes, considering the North Dakota legislature is about to pass House Bill 1546 to ban dismemberment abortions, and the U.S. House introduced a similar ban, would you introduce this measure into the U.S. Senate? And then he links to, on congress.gov, H.R. 956 to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit dismemberment abortions and for other purposes.
Yeah, if we don't already have the bill, if the bill's been introduced, I've already co-sponsored. We had a rash of just a great week during the March for Life, where we were putting pro-life bills into the hopper every day and giving speeches on all of them. I'm trying to recall. I don't recall one that's specific to dismemberment. We of course have the late term. We tried to have a voice vote the other night on Ben Sass's Born Alive protection bill. By voice vote, what you need is you can just do it by acclamation unless somebody objects. And in this case, Democratic Senator Patty Murray from Washington State objected to a bill that would protect babies after they're born. Hard to imagine, but that's where we are now in the Democratic Party in America. And I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. So I'll look at it, and if it's one that hasn't been introduced, I'm happy to introduce it. And if it's one that is introduced, I'm happy to co-sponsor it if I'm not already.
Bruce says, keep up the good work, Kevin. And that's it.
Thanks, Bruce.
All right.
Rob, I like this. I like doing this. Look forward to doing it again next week. And the nice thing about this is it provides both of us a little bit of flexibility too. Should things come up?
We can fit it in better. And also, we don't have that commercial break constantly bearing down on us as we're trying to I'm like, all right, you got 30 seconds to answer this hugely complicated, convoluted question. It's so yeah, I like it. We get all the time we need. And Kevin, as always, thank you for the time.
All right, Rob. Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes are released Monday through Friday, right away in the morning, so you can listen when you want to listen. You can subscribe to the podcast. If you go to sayanythingblog.com, click on the Plain Talk podcast. We've got all the links for you to subscribe there for the podcasting service of your choice. If you search on a lot of these services, you should be able to find me as well. Search for Plain Talk with Rob Port. You can certainly follow the blog, sayanythingblog.com. All the new episodes will be posted there. If you follow me on social media, Facebook, Twitter, both myself, Rob Port, and sayanythingblog.com are on those social media platforms. Give us a follow or a like or whatever there. And if you have any problems with any of this, or you want to give me feedback for the show, or if you want to submit questions for the weekly appearances of Senator Cramer, which was today's episode, or Congressman Kelly Armstrong, who is also going to be appearing weekly, you can email all of that stuff to rob@sayanythingblog.com, or even if you just want to say hi. I like it when people say hi. That's it for today's show. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.